Hello, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby, as well as one of your chef instructors in the courses. And today's event is my office hours. And this is your chance to ask me questions that are related to cooking and also food. And I'll do my best to respond to those questions. I see that we already have a number of questions entered into the queue, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your page. And as we get started, I'll mention a couple of items to help guide you through this process today. And the first one is, in order to facilitate the conversation here, feel free to enter any questions or comments that you might have in the dialog box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the note that says add question here. Those will make their way to me, to the queue that you see on the right-hand side of the page. And the second thing to note is if you look at the individual questions that are already posted, in the upper right-hand corner of those individual questions, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. If you would like that question answered sooner than later, please click on that heart-shaped icon and it'll push it up in priority in the queue, okay? But fear not, I will answer all the questions today, all right? And, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in to the questions. So number one, batting leadoff. All right, is Robert. Hey, Robert. Let's see. Enjoy the platform. So many pearls. Excellent. I'm glad you find benefit in your experience here. This is certainly a lot of fun for me as well as my colleagues here at Ruby. And I hope you're engaged every day in your course. Thank you. When roasting without oil, in the oven, does it make a difference? Utilizing a convection option seems like it should. If so, how should the times or temperatures be adjusted compared to conventional ovens? Okay, let me answer this generally. Okay, this two-part question. So the first thing that I'll mention to the general audience is that the convection setting on an oven that has a convection option has a fan in the back of the oven that circulates the hot air during the baking or roasting cycle. And that creates more even browning and also quicker browning as that air more actively engages with the food product. Okay, I'll mention another logistical sort of a strategy issue or concern to keep in mind if you're using a convection setting, and that is as the air is circulating throughout the oven, okay, if you have a high-sided container of your food, the air is going to come around and bump into the side, make its way up, and then around, okay? And so if you have food items down here low, they're not going to brown as efficiently as if you had a shallow-sided container, right? Where the air would come around and could more easily then make contact with the food. So try to use a sheet pan rather than a roasting pan or a cake pan, for example, okay, for most expedient browning. So now on to Robert's questions. There's certainly going to be some variability here, so I'm going to give a general response, all right? And it's certainly going to depend upon the details of the food as well as your particular oven. But the cooking temperature, I would start off by dropping the temperature by at least 25 degrees, if not about 50. And I recommend taking notes, okay, so that you can fine tune that process for yourself. And then on the cooking time, you might start by dropping the cooking time by about 25% and then make some adjustments from there. Again, depending on the item, the size of the item, for example, and the actual temperature setting, it could well cut more than 25% off of the cooking time. But just as a general starting point, keep those guidelines in mind, dropping the temp by 25 to 50 degrees and cutting 25% off the cooking time. Of course, checking for doneness along the way, okay, that so you can determine what is best for your equipment, your particular situation. All right, thank you. All right, now next up from Susan. I love my Vitamix, but it does not do well with small quantities. Yes. What appliance do you recommend that can do well with small batches that will be smooth and creamy? Okay, I've got a couple of thoughts that come to mind. Number one is that Vitamix, at least with some of their models, I think it's limited to maybe 1 or 2 series of their models, does have small containers that will fit into the base in place of the 64 fluid ounce bowl, for example. And these containers that I'm familiar with are 32 fluid ounces. The small one is 8 fluid ounces. And I think there's something in between. And so you might take a look at the Vitamix website first to see if the model that you have is compatible with these smaller attachments. Excuse me. And if that's not an option for you, then you might consider a backup appliance. And I have been in this position for many, many years. And I have used what is marketed as a spice grinder or a coffee grinder. So they're going to be your typical size, but there's going to be a small detachable bowl. And that's the key. If you can find one that has a detachable bowl, then that gives you just a lot of flexibility as you're working with wet items and pasty items as well as dry items. And there are a number of different companies, a number of different brands of these spice/coffee grinders that have a small detachable bowl. So that's where I would direct you. Price points are generally affordable, $40, give or take a little bit, depending on, what you might reach for. All right. Thank you. And next up, what can I substitute for eggs and butter when baking? I know applesauce is an option, but it takes a much longer time to cook. Okay, so let's break this down. Okay, this is one of these wonderful substitution questions. And we need to first think about the function of the particular ingredient in the original recipe, and then think about what ingredient or usually ingredients will be suitable substitutes for the original. Okay, so starting with the butter first, this is going to be the easier one. There are a number of plant-based butter options on the market today. All right, and if we think about some of these other plant-based dairy product companies like Kite Hill or Miyoko's, these are brands that come to mind that also sell butter, plant-based butter products. And so do consider that. If you're making products in a commercial setting, a larger volume cookery, I would recommend considering Faba butter, which is from Fora Foods, F-O-R-A. And they're a New York-based company, and they make a very nice product, which at present, I believe, is available in commercial packaging. So you would need to procure that through a wholesaler, okay? But otherwise, for the rest of us at home, do consider some of these options that have been around for some time now. Regarding eggs become a little bit more difficult to make a substitution for because the role of eggs is much more complex. And so let's think about the function of eggs, and it's going to depend upon the preparation, the recipe or the formula as well. So eggs, let me think through this here. Eggs provide flavor, they provide moisture, they provide protein, nutrition in that more broad sense, and from a culinary standpoint, they provide structure. And moisture and structure are the big ones to consider. So regarding moisture, okay, you mentioned applesauce. So applesauce or banana puree or other fruit or vegetable purees would be a suitable substitute for the moisture component lent by eggs. You mentioned a concern of much longer cooking time. Yes, that's true, because of the added moisture that is going to come from a substitution like applesauce. All right. So that's going to be an issue that we need to work with by longer cooking times, perhaps a lower oven temperature. Okay. And, you might start out by just lowering the temperature by, 10 or 20 degrees or so and extending that time as needed. So you'll need to do some testing for doneness to figure out what's going to be appropriate for your desired outcome. Okay. And as I mentioned in the previous question, there's going to be some variability based upon your equipment, right, and the specific ingredients that you are using. All right. Let's take a look at a couple of the other roles that eggs play in food. So if it's going to be something like protein, then you can bring in maybe flax seeds, or it could even be a bean puree. If it's structure, then oftentimes recipes will call for flax seed or chia seeds that have that gelling quality to add some structure in place of eggs. Eggs provide greater structure than chia or flax. So if you want a more rigid, firmer structure, then you want to think about a gum. So something like a guar gum, which is a very popular, commonly used ingredient in many baking formulas for breads and quick breads. Okay. And so it becomes a multi-pronged approach to replace that single ingredient, the egg. So think about those options as you take notes and experiment in the kitchen. Thank you. Next question from Erica. Can I freeze miso paste without killing the active cultures? So what I understand regarding the freezing of things like miso and yogurt, for example, that have these enzymes and probiotic qualities is that yes, you can freeze them, but the count will decrease. And how much will it decrease? I'm not sure. And the limited information that I've looked at indicates some variability. So what I've come across is that it can decrease quite a bit, maybe upwards of or not even upwards, but in the range of 90% or even more. But there appears that there will be some live culture remaining. Okay, so it sounds like a significant hit. But the answer generally would be yes to your question. All right, thank you. Next up from Allison. Hello. I was chopping veggies today and came up with this question. Is there a trick to stop food from jumping over the knife and getting in the way of chopping? This happens frequently as I chop. Should I try a bigger knife? I know what you mean. And so the basic reason is probably twofold from my experience. I mean, one is that to some extent, certain things will stick to the blade, and as we go in for a subsequent cut, it's pushed up, and sometimes that bounces over the knife, and then we end up chopping over it again. Another reason is that there's a little bit of spring or tension in a vegetable as we cut into it, and as we cut through and that tension is released, sometimes it kind of springs back a little bit. A couple of ways that I have worked with that is to either cut more slowly. If I feel it's important that I don't recut any of those pieces, if the appearance is really going to be that important to me in that application. Sometimes it is, most of the time it's not. The other way around that is, you've got your guide hand and your knife working. As you make that slice, you can reach over and release the items from the blade, bring that finger over and reset for the next cut. And that becomes a slower process as well, but it is effective. And so those are a couple of ideas for you. All right, thank you. And next question. Hello, Sharon. Thanks for these office hours. You bet. It is my pleasure. Lots of fun to engage with all of you in this virtual sort of way. What's the fastest way to get the skins off cooking beans like chickpeas and lima beans? The method that I've used whenever I've taken skins off of beans, especially these firmer beans like chickpeas and limas that you mentioned, is to cool them down a little bit. Of course, you can get your hands in the water, and then under running water going into the pot, I will even sometimes set the pot up at an angle by propping an edge up in the sink, just a little bit, and then slowly run some water in at the top edge, okay? And then I'm going to gently rub my hands together, scooping up the beans and kind of sloughing off the skins. And then as that water fills up in the pot and exits on the opposite side, it'll carry those skins over and out because the skins tend to float. Most of them do, probably 95% of them do. Okay, and so that's my approach to removing skins. Thank you. Next question. What is the skillet recommended? Are pans with a coating for easier cleanup recommended, or is it best to choose an uncoated surface? This may have been answered previously, but I seem to have missed the answer. Thank you for asking that question today. Regarding cookware, my personal preference is to use uncoated cookware. And what I'm using largely is stainless steel and also cast iron. And I also have, right now 2 coated, non-stick pans for special finicky things, whether it's whatever it is. If I'm doing oil-free potatoes, then I might use that because potatoes are really tough to work with without a lot of lubricant, a lot of oil. And then certainly if you're cooking, other high protein items, like eggs are going to be a classic example, then a nonstick pan is really pretty handy. But, I recommend a non-stick coating for limited use because they will get scratched over time and you'll need to replace them. And so I consider a non-stick pan a disposable item, whereas stainless steel is pretty easy to clean up and maintenance is very, very simple. And now, albeit it does take some elbow grease. But otherwise, the surface itself will last you a lifetime, literally. Cast iron is pretty easy to work with, but it does need some occasional maintenance in the form of seasoning. So you just have to keep your eye on, how that surface builds up and how it wears down through the cooking cycles. All right. I think that answers the question. Mainly uncoated, but with 1 or 2 coated pans for special applications. Thank you. And next up from Faith, I don't have any food-related questions right now. All right. I just wanted to share that. I'm so very impressed with the information being taught in the plant-based professional course. Thank you all. Great job. Faith, thank you very much for reaching out. The Pro Plant course is, one of our flagship courses and has been popular for a long time. And it's, one of my favorites as well. It covers wonderful content, and I'm very pleased to know that you're enjoying your experience. Thank you. And next question. One of the things I have found difficult is standing comfortably while doing the cutting exercises. I broke up the work with rests, which seemed to help. Do you have any tips for those of us challenged by our posture or physical limitations? Yes, I've got a few thoughts to share, and it's certainly much easier, of course, if I'm standing beside you, so that I can take a look at the way you're doing your work from different angles, which I have done many times, with my cooking students on ground. But let's work through this online here. All right. The first thing is to engage with your body. Okay, really focus on your body and feel what's comfortable. What is going to be the more natural posture. And I'll go through a few different things. We want to think about all the joints, okay? Neck, hips, knees, ankles, all the joints from head to toe. So, in terms of our food to knife angle, okay, think about what is going to be most comfortable, and place the food and your knife at that angle and try that work. Our height, the cutting board, the work surface height, the cutting board, the food, the knife is going to be very important. And, you can certainly wear high heels, and I don't mean like, let's go out on the town in high heels, but rather, high heel clogs, which are common in professional kitchens, for example. Or you can raise up a table, or you can stand on a base of some sort that's going to be a safe surface for you to work on, so you don't fall off, not too small. Or we can raise up the cutting board, and that could be through stacking a couple of cutting boards, or it could be through a thicker cutting board. Okay, if we need to raise something up, or the opposite might be true if you're very tall. We don't want to be hunched over, reaching down to your cutting board. So you want to lower the cutting surface. So think about the height, and then typically when we cut, we're not square to the cutting board, but we're at an angle to the cutting board, and then we work with our other angles with our elbow and shoulder. So you need to figure out how to rotate your hips, rotate your feet, and therefore your knees will follow. Okay. And then also bend at the knees, get a little bit of spring in there so that we're not putting too much weight, on the joints themselves. And so there's a multi-step process here, but step one really is for you to feel your body and figure out which angles are going to be most comfortable and natural for you, and to go with that. Okay. I have had students in the past send me video clips for analysis, which of course I'm happy to do. But otherwise, see if what I just explained can help work through this situation. Okay. And, please feel free to follow up as needed. All right. Thank you. One more thing, Maria, that I'll mention about this whole cutting experience, and this is really a generalized, little bit that I want to share with everybody, and that is when we start out with the whole cutting process, it's pretty common that we grip the knife really strong because we're focused and we want to get everything right, and that just creates tension all the way through our body. It's really amazing. And that can easily result in stiff shoulders and a stiff neck and a sore back and hips. So with practice and with, again, some engagement, we want to relax our grip. And with all those other positionings in mind that I just mentioned, that's going to bring more relaxation to the entire body. Okay, and that should help the situation as well. Thank you. Next up, should the strings be removed from celery? Also, same question about snow peas and snap peas. My quick response is, only if you find them offensive. On one hand, it's fiber, it's edible, but on the other hand, if you find it bothersome, if they really are tough and you're just chewing on them and chewing on them, and end up pulling them out of your mouth and setting them on the rim of your plate, then yeah, you might pull them off beforehand. But there are other times, especially when those vegetables are relatively young still and in a nice fresh state, that fiber is tender enough to eat through. And so it's really on a case-by-case basis and based upon your personal preference. Personally, I like my fiber. One of my favorite four-letter, or not four-letter, but one of my favorite F words. So do keep that in mind from a health perspective as well. Thank you. Next, how will we know what we need for food prior to the lesson? So Megan, it really is necessary to skip ahead 2 or 3 tasks and see what's coming up. And the reason why I say this at this point is because for most of our practice activities as well as graded assignments, you will be given options of recipes to choose from. And so right there is a variable, right, between students. Also, if you need to adjust quantities based upon the audience that you're cooking for, that's another variable to consider. And if you have any substitutions that are necessary based upon food availability, based upon any other food prescriptions, maybe due to allergies or something else, then you'll need to make adjustments to the recipe. And so in the end, each student ends up with a different, a unique shopping list. And so at this point, I certainly ask that you skip ahead a couple of tasks and see what's coming down the pike, in terms of the cooking options for you. Thank you. And let's see, next question. I live on an island, so prices depend on seasonal and international availability. Example, zucchini has been 36 New Zealand dollars per kilogram because of COVID-19 shipping restrictions from Australia. Will substitutions be allowed? The quick answer is yes. Substitutions certainly are allowed and even encouraged so that you can learn how to adapt and adjust recipes to create new outcomes. Now, having said that, please keep in mind that all of our assignments have learning outcomes associated with that lesson. And so as you make a substitution, it needs to remain aligned with the learning outcome of that assignment. And if you're not sure, please send us a message and, we can certainly help troubleshoot for you. Okay. And, in those sort of inquiries, please include as much detail as possible. For example, what ingredients you have access to. And, we can best tell you what to avoid or what to consider. I'll give you an example. On occasion, I get a clear soup recipe and someone says, no one will eat cabbage in our house. So I changed from cabbage soup to cream of corn soup. That's great, except now you didn't make a clear soup for the clear soup assignment. So in other words, the learning outcome was not met. And I am in a position to give you a 0 for the assignment and ask you to redo it. So that's the scenario that I'd like to avoid with just a little bit of clarification on a case-by-case basis as needed. All right, thank you. Next up, dry heat or no oil saute question. Is an enameled cast iron Dutch oven, for example, or that is, let's see, Le Creuset, to be specific, not recommended for the no oil saute and mercury ball test. My 3-quart Dutch oven turned very dark and was a bear to clean. Onions browned beautifully, though. Yes, I know that experience. And so, my first recommendation is for the mercury ball test, because that calls for a really high temperature. I would avoid an enameled cast iron pan. Okay. In the short term, the browning of the pan and the cleaning effort is going to be present. The bigger issue for me is that that high heat for that pan will prematurely loosen up the enameling. And I don't know how quickly this will occur, but I have worked with enameled pans where the enameling starts to come off right from the surface of the cast iron, and you get this chipping and flaking. And this extreme high heat will only hasten that otherwise natural process, that natural breakdown of that surface. So I generally don't recommend those extreme high heats for an enameled cast iron pan. Instead, use an unenameled, unlined cast iron pan or stainless steel. All right, thank you. Next up, when oven temperatures are mentioned in a recipe and nothing is said about what kind of oven, hot air or conventional, what should I use? So the default equipment in a recipe, in a baking or roasting recipe, is a conventional oven, so not a convection oven. Okay. And then you can make adjustments from there in terms of if you have a convection setting, and then experimenting with lowering the temperature and shortening the cooking time as needed for your particular situation. All right, thank you. And next up, also from Myra, here in the Netherlands, I sometimes find garlic, which is just one round bulb with one big clove in it. What do you think of these? Do you use them? I haven't used garlic as you describe it. That is one big clove. However, I have used what we call around here elephant garlic. And in fact, just down the highway here in Oregon, we've got the annual Elephant Garlic Festival that features the garlic kind of like what you're describing. And, you'll need to just taste it. I've used it. It can be quite fine. But the garlic flavor intensity can vary quite a bit between garlic varieties. And some of them are really mild, such that we find garlic ice cream, in this area from time to time. And they use these more mild, large varieties. And so just give it a try and see how you like it. But otherwise, I think it's quite fine if you enjoy it. All right, thank you. All right, next up. How do high school culinary instructors use Ruby in their classrooms to supplement what they teach in their classes? Any suggestions for how to use Ruby while teaching hybrid or all virtual but live classes? So I will give just a couple of ideas. I'll share a couple of thoughts, but Deb, it certainly sounds like you're a high school culinary instructor, and if so, I would recommend that you reach out to us through support@ruby.com, and our high school team can spend as much time as you need to walk through the options and to find a solution that will best fit your situation. Okay, but one way that some people use Ruby is to have students watch particular lessons that you designate that are aligned with the lesson that you'll be teaching the next day. And so students would watch the lesson and do the readings ahead of time as homework in preparation of the upcoming lesson live in your lab. And then they've got the fundamental sort of foundational understanding walking into class. And then what you're doing is clarifying any answers. You're providing some repetition in that exposure to learning, which is part of the solidifying of the learning process from the student's perspective. Okay, and then other ways that students use Ruby is to have students walk through on their own at home a cooking exercise. And they can submit that lesson for grading either to us, our instructional team here at Ruby, or to you and your culinary team, depending on the arrangement that you have with Ruby. And then students can follow up with some sort of discussion or a demo or something at your end during the live session. Okay, and so those are a couple of options, but there are other ways to go about it too. But for a more in-depth discussion on the options, reach out to us. Thank you. And next up, when steaming baby potatoes, how can I prevent the skins from becoming chewy or tough? That can be a tough one to deal with, no pun intended. The quick solution is to peel the potatoes to just get rid of the problem. Another option is to, once they're cooked, to cut the potatoes into smaller pieces in order to reduce the size of that chewiness, so it's not quite so noticeable. Okay, and then also the skin thickness will depend upon the variety of potato as well. So you might try some other options and see if you find some that have a skin that's thin enough that it satisfies the desire that you have in mind. Okay, thank you. And next up from Sammy, hello. Can we do brining for a long period of time? So 24 hours, for example, or, should we follow the size and weight? And is it possible if we brine any cut, can we do a marination? Okay, so if yes, how long can we do both? So the first part of your question is the duration of brining. And, brines very often have about 10, well, not 10%, but probably half that much, 5% salinity approximately. And so the goal of the brining, of course, is to draw in the salt for seasoning. It also begins to change the water content because it will pull in water as water attaches to the salt molecule. And then there can also be some shift in the texture of the meat. Okay, and I guess I should also differentiate between wet brining and dry brining. So wet brining is when we make a salt water solution. It could have other flavors added to it, but fundamentally salt and water with your usually a meat item added to it. Dry brining is when we would put salt on the surface of that dry piece of meat and then put it in the refrigerator for some period of time. Okay. 24 hours is often an upper limit because foods begin to get too salty. Okay. But it's going to depend upon the size of that food item. Okay. And just how you will handle it after that. So there is a little bit of variability there, but generally, I mean, not a whole lot longer than that, only because things get too salty. But I encourage you to do some experimentation to see how you like those results. Now, in terms of a second step of marination, that's, it's certainly possible, and it's just up to you. But we would consider it unnecessary because it is a duplicate step of the earlier brining. All right, the marination is going to contain salt as well as other flavoring. But I think if you wanted to split that up in some way and let's say do a brine and then apply a dry herb and or spice rub without salt, that's an option, right? The thing I'm trying to mitigate here is the salt so that we don't get too much because the food becomes, of course, inedible at that point. But the other flavorings we can work with in some different ways. So it's all up to you and some experimentation in your kitchen. But all this is possible, okay, but not common. All right, thank you. All right, next up. How can I saute zucchini so that it still tastes fresh and bright, but not raw, and doesn't taste squashy and overcooked? There's a tipping point. I seem to always miss and end up with soggy zucchini. So Susan, you're asking the perennial question of cooking, and that is, how do I control time and temperature? So those two variables are at the basis of most cooking most of the time. And it's when, in fact, we can control time and temperature that we have arrived, so to speak, in terms of being able to handle food and cooking. So you're on the learning curve, and you're heading in the right direction through this experience that you're building. The one thing to keep in mind with the zucchini or other varieties of summer squash is that high heat, I find high heat to be beneficial. And so you're getting a nice cooked, often caramelized outer surface, and then a relatively short cooking time so the heat doesn't fully penetrate to the center. So you still have a toothsome center remaining. Also keep in mind carryover cooking. And so that intense heat that you're applying to the exterior, after you pull that food off the fire, that heat will continue to penetrate in the form of carryover cooking toward the center. So the object of the game here is to pull the product off the fire and out of the pan while it's got enough intensity to penetrate just to that point where you like it in terms of that residual texture. Okay. And that's where the practice comes in. Okay. And so, with that in mind, keep on working your way up that learning curve. Okay. But that's all that's to it. Very, very simple. Control time and temperature. Thank you. All right. Next up, Carol. What size or type of mortar would you recommend that I buy for crushing some spices? I probably won't be using a mortar as much as you do. You have mentioned that you have several sizes and types. Just want one that will be appropriate for occasional use. So I've got a couple of mortar pestle sets within reach here, and I'll show you these as I continue to put them into some context by talking. The first one is pretty small. You can kind of see how it compares to my hand or my face here. And, I use this a lot for small quantities of spices. In other words, for a lot of the routine cooking that we do it here at home. So something like this is going to be fine. This one happens to be made out of marble, but I don't think the material is going to be such a big deal. And then the other one is a little bit bigger. This is made out of porcelain. This happens to have a wooden pestle. Just in comparison here, right? They look like this. This one could be a little bit more all-purpose. It's got a little bit more volume to it, and certainly with this larger size pestle, it's got some nice surface area to do the crushing with. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is as the mortar gets bigger, the bowl gets bigger, you also want to have a correspondingly larger pestle. Otherwise, if it's too narrow or too small, you're going to be chasing around peppercorns and other food inside the bowl here. Okay, but something probably in between or any of these sizes here or in between would be appropriate, I think, to what you're describing. Okay, and then of course there are bigger models that I have shown before that I use quite a bit for our spices during cooking, but give that a try. Okay, thank you. All right, next up from Wendy. I don't understand how pan frying and sauteing is dry heat cooking method when you use some fat. That seems wet to me. This is a question that I get every once in a while, and I've been getting this question for the last couple of decades. And very simply, the definition of dry heat cooking methods is the absence of water. Okay, the absence of moisture from water. Okay, fat is not water, and fat acts very differently from water when cooking. And so the presence of fat falls within the dry heat realm. Okay, let me give you an example. When we simmer, right, or boil, I don't want, maybe I shouldn't say boil, but when we simmer food, like let's say potatoes, they don't take on any color, okay? And then they get done and they're nice and soft. When we put those same potatoes in a pot full of hot oil, right, hot fat, they start to shrivel up because water is being pulled out and they develop browning, okay? And so the fat is acting in a very different sort of way. It's removing water from the food item, so it's really acting as a dry heat medium, just as we would see if we put those potatoes in a saute pan or in the oven for roasting. We get caramelization, right, or otherwise browning, and some shriveling of the product as moisture, i.e. water, is lost to the environment. Okay, and so hopefully those examples will help you understand and remember why fats fall within the dry heat cooking methods. Okay, very simply, the absence of water defines dry heat cooking. All right, thank you. And next up, if I want to substitute quinoa for couscous in a Moroccan recipe, do I steam the quinoa the same way as one would steam the couscous, or should I cook the quinoa with the boiling method? My recommendation is to use what we call the pasta method, which I think is what you're referring to, right? It's boiling water and cooking the grain, whatever it is, in this case, quinoa, or it could be something else, in lots of water. And then once that grain reaches the desired doneness, go ahead and strain it, and then you can add it to whatever cooking next step that you have going in the process. All right, so that's going to be my recommendation. It's going to be easy to control for doneness. All right, thank you. And next question. In the Forks Over Knives Ultimate Cooking Course, Task 116, making maple chipotle candied walnuts, Step 3, dehydrating the walnuts. Is there a way to use your oven for this step if you don't have a dehydrating machine? Yes. Use your oven on the lowest setting. And on my oven here at home, the lowest setting is still about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty darn hot. So what I do is I prop the door open, probably an inch or so, and let that heat out. And I use a wooden spoon, but use whatever you want to use. And then that'll help with the drying process. It's probably going to be hotter still than most dehydrators, but that's the best I can do at home, and that's my recommendation for you. Thank you. And next question. When preparing a recipe with dry ingredients, when is the sifting? I prepare my mise en place, which of course involves measuring, but in so many recipes, after I gather mise en place, one of the first steps is to sift and measure the dry ingredients. Aha. So I guess it can be in a couple of different places. If you're going to just move on into your baking process right away, then you can do the measuring and sifting really in one step. And then that's your mise en place, right? Otherwise, the sifting is going to occur just before you introduce that dry ingredient, the flour, for example, into what the mixing bowl, and as you proceed with that step. But either one is going to be fine. If you do the sifting early when you measure, I recommend that you immediately proceed with your cooking or baking process rather than letting it sit for a couple of hours, for example. And the reason why I say that is because depending on the humidity in your environment, the flour can absorb humidity and sort of get clumpy and change a little bit. So if you're just going to proceed, then all is good. But either way is going to be fine at either time, okay, in the process. Thank you. And next up, we got a couple questions from Lorena. How are you doing? Working on a recipe here. Will you share your best French fry recipe? Which knife cut you use? Do you freeze the cut potatoes beforehand or not? Any extra tips? You have a couple of ideas to share with you, and there is freezing involved in one of these suggestions and not in the other. In terms of knife cuts, these can vary as well. The thinner the cut, the better chance of drawing out water or the moisture and resulting in a crispier French fry. Okay, so a julienne, okay, is going to be a pretty small cut that I will use sometimes. Also, the bâtonnet. All right, so the julienne is 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch by whatever length you want it to be, 2 or 3 inches, for example. And a bâtonnet is 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, again by some length. So it's a skinny, long cut, and either one of those is going to be fine. And Patrick has just listed up a couple of French fry recipes, one from Ruby, and then one from Serious Eats. And I believe this is from Kenji Lopez at Serious Eats. And Patrick, could you also list up the book, The Food Lab, for the reference here? And, I've actually made these French fries with Kenji, and they turn out really good. And so I wanted to share this with you, as well as his book, The Food Lab. And Kenji Lopez takes just a wonderful approach to cooking in this book, where he sets up an experiment every time in his kitchen and has run through so many examples, and he's got some very nice results. And you might consider his book as a reference also. All right, so give those a try, Lorena, and see how you like them. All right. And then next up, a tofu question. When you freeze tofu to obtain the meaty texture, do you press and drain it before? If so, what happens when you marinate after that for, say, baked tofu? Won't it absorb liquid again, overriding the previous process? Okay, so let me break this down here. So let me give you a quick result here. Okay, so when I'm making a tofu steak or something that I want to be firm and meaty in texture, I'm going to use a firmer style of tofu. Right? I prefer firm. I can also find extra firm down the street at a grocery store, so I'll reach for those. And if you don't press the water out before freezing, then the expansion of water as it freezes will disrupt the integrity of the tofu, such that when you thaw it to use, it'll have a looser texture. It'll still have some meatiness to it because it's just more dense in the firm or extra firm style. But the ice crystals during the freezing process will push apart the curd structure a little bit, and it'll loosen it up a little bit. So I like to press it at least a little bit and get some of that excess water out. Go through the freeze process, which will further firm up that texture. And then, when you go to marinate it, you'll bring in some liquid, but it's not, it's not all water at that point. Or I guess it could be, watery, depending on your use of or omission of oil, for example. But limit the amount of marination, the exposure to that liquid. You can control that at that point. And then do some experiments. Again, I'm all about experiments. Take notes, right? If you limit the contact time with the marinating liquid, then you might want to increase the intensity of the flavor to achieve your desired results. But give that a try, and you'll find something that you like in there in terms of a balance. All right, thank you. All right, next question. Thanks for a great job answering our questions. You're welcome, Claire. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, and I hope you're having a lot of fun viewing and listening in on all of this. Thank you. Here's mine this week. When I buy veggies, I keep them in their plastic bag and put them in the crisper. When washing them, when I'm ready to use them, but should I wash them before I put them in the crisper? That is going to depend upon probably what the item is. I'm trying to think of some of my washings in the last couple of weeks or so, and my quick response would be it's going to depend on what the item is. Very often when we wash something, especially more delicate items like leafy items, whether they're lettuces or herbs, the presence of water on the leaf afterwards, back in the refrigerator, can shorten the shelf life. So a salad spinner works very, very well. And in restaurants in the past, I have used that technique where I'll prep leaves ahead of time, rinsing them, and then give them a really good spinning. And then the shelf life is extended very nicely. I will put a wet towel over those leaves in order to maintain moisture in that container with a lid on it. Okay, you want to protect the product from the drying effect of the air circulation in the refrigerator, hence the damp towel. Now, at that point, keep in mind that some things, some lettuces, for example, will brown quicker than others. So you'll need to kind of manage that process and which ones you do or don't want to use based upon the desired end result, right? The appearance of, the presence or absence of that rusty, oxidized look on any cut or broken surfaces. Other items. Let me go back to the salad spinning. When you're spinning an item, you give it that first good spin, and then let it come to a stop, and then fluff up all the items in the hopper, and then give it a second spin, because you will most always pull out a second bunch of water. And I think that's very important, that second spinning, for best quality. Now, otherwise, other items that are a little bit firmer in texture, they hold quite well to a rinsing first and then storage in the refrigerator. Okay, and so do some experimenting based upon those broad categories I just mentioned. All right, thank you. And next up, hi, do you have good tips on how to cook brown rice to make it more tasty? Boy, do I have tips. So, I think the first thing with brown rice is to hit that desired texture that's going to be most satisfying on your palate. And some people like it a little bit more chewy, and others like it a little bit softer, like, I'll use the word mushy, but just a little bit softer in terms of breaking down the bran layer on the outside. So the water to grain ratio and the cooking time is going to be most important. And the nice thing with brown rice and other forms of whole grain that have the bran layer intact is that you can always add more water during the cooking process if it's still too firm for you. Okay. Another recommendation that I have for cooking these whole grains is that once they have reached the desired state of doneness, is to let it cool down with a lid on it, so that all of that moisture that is in the form of gas, right, in the form of steam, will reabsorb into the grains. Otherwise, if you remove the lid, all that steam escapes and you lose a lot of moisture, and that soft grain will firm up a little bit. Okay. Now you can use that as a strategy for a little bit of firmer grain, or you can keep it softer by keeping a lid on it and letting that moisture reabsorb. And then, of course, it's I think good practice to fluff up the grains after cooling, so that it has the optimum texture, right? Because the texture is a big part of your eating enjoyment of any food. Otherwise, in terms of adding other taste or flavor components, it all depends on what direction you want to pull this brown rice or other whole grain into, right? In terms of flavor profiles, I always think of regional cuisines and profiles, and sometimes I'll add a piece of kombu to the rice while it's cooking, and that infuses some nice umami notes and some richness to the rice. Sometimes it's a pandan leaf. If I have a pandan leaf that's in its fresh form, again, it gives it some aroma, which adds complexity to that end product, and also can go very nicely with whatever you're serving it with, a stir fry or a curry or something else. Okay. To salt or not to salt is totally up to you. Okay. And that's based upon regional tradition as well as personal preference. And so keep those basics in mind as you work with brown rice and other whole grains. Thank you. And next up, there have been questions about proper washing and storage of vegetables, but what about fruits? Are some better off being stored in the fridge? Apples, stone fruits, etc. Fruits, tend to be more firm. Well, I guess berries would be an exception, but many of them, especially stone fruits, as you mentioned here, apples, pears, grapes, and they can stand up to an initial rinsing before being put out on your counter or stored in some way for the eating. Berries, especially raspberries, blackberries, boysenberries, marionberries, can be very fragile. And some strawberry varieties as well. Here in Oregon, we've got hood strawberries, which are kind of the prize of the season. And, those things have a shelf life of hours. And they are, if they're rinsed, they're done very gently. They're dried very gently and used immediately. And then if again, some of those fragile items, also, if you're not using them immediately, they tend to mold very quickly. All right, so blueberries sometimes can do that, and certainly raspberries can do that, blackberries can do that. So to extend the shelf life, the refrigerator, right, is going to be a good place to store those things. Apples and stone fruit, I like to keep those out as long as I can get to them, eat them reasonably quickly. So peaches and nectarines and pears and apples. And I find that the eating enjoyment and the aroma and therefore the flavor quality is enhanced at a slightly warmer temperature, i.e. room temperature versus a refrigerator temperature. But those are going to be personal preferences, and there might also be some variability based upon how you will use that product. Okay, is it going to go into a pie? Or are you going to, eat it just as a standalone fruit? So you'll need to kind of do some experimenting, I think, and to see which method to the madness is going to be best for you. All right. Thank you. All right, next up. What are staples that you recommend always having on hand in the kitchen? Now, this is a great question, a very interesting question, I think, because it's really unique to your setting and the skill set that you have, the equipment that you have, and the type of cooking that you do. And also the flavor profiles that you enjoy building. So again, I think about regional cuisines and those basic flavor profiles. I'll run through some of the staples that I have at home right now, based upon sort of the array of cooking that we do from day to day and week to week. But the staples would include 2 or 3 varieties of miso paste. We've got Indian pickles, probably anywhere from 3 to 6 or 7 varieties at a time. And we use those not only as a pickle side condiment, but also as an ingredient, a flavorful ingredient in other preparations. It could go in a stir fry or something else. In the dry category, we've got spices, and probably a dozen spices, but a core of a half a dozen spices. There's black pepper and cumin and cardamom and I'm thinking of the Marathi terms here, but coriander and cinnamon and cloves and vanilla beans, and then a bunch of other stuff, saffron and this and that. In terms of legumes, there's always 2 or 3, 4 varieties of legumes. We've got some Appaloosas in the house. We got a 25-pound bag of black-eyed peas, and then probably 5 pounds of black beans right now. Grains, basmati rice in the white form, oftentimes brown basmati, white Japanese style, brown Japanese style, and wild rice, quinoa, often a couple of varieties, whether it's black, red, or white. We've got whole oat groats as well as rolled oats, and we've got a bin full of rye berries. We just exhausted our wheat berries a couple of weeks ago. So these are the examples of some of the staples that we have in the house. And then from that, we can go in all kinds of directions, right, in terms of flavor combinations. And I guess, other fruits and vegetables would be, mirepoix, right? So onions, and you've got carrots and celery and garlic and parsley and cilantro and fresh limes and sometimes fresh lemons. And also oranges. I like to use the zest from any of those fruits as well as the juice from any of those fruits in a lot of my cooking to add some freshness, some lightness. So those are some ideas in terms of staples that work for us. Again, think about the type of cooking that you do in terms of the desired flavor profile outcomes, and then start to build up an inventory from there. And then, see how that carries you into the future. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I'd like to try roasting vegetables using aquafaba instead of oil to encourage browning. Any tips? I haven't used aquafaba in for roasting vegetables, but I would say, go for it. The basic procedure that we recommend at Ruby is to is very often to toss or to baste roasted vegetables in a little bit of stock to sort of keep it moist, right, as it goes through this dehydration phase in the oven and develops browning. And you can always add more liquid to it. But the aquafaba will certainly have other components to it. The sugars and proteins that will facilitate the caramelization or the Maillard browning, but all of it is browning in flavor in the end. So give it a try, right, and see how you like it. All right, thank you. All right, Next up, I only have one question as of now. I learned that we shouldn't cook and eat burgers from ground beef rare or medium rare. How come every steakhouse and restaurant always asks how you want the burger? Okay. So, yeah, this is a fun question because on one hand, you've got the government guidelines for food safety and sanitation that intersect with sort of personal preference and customs, right, around or conventions around cooking, just the way we've done things. So, on one hand, regarding in the case of the United States, the United States Food and Drug Administration has what's called the Food Code, and that's sort of the mothership of all of the food safety guidelines that are disseminated to local governments as well as restaurants, and some of it even trickles down to us in our home kitchens. And as governments do when it comes to public safety, a lot of the times, I guess, they err on the safe side, on the conservative side. And they say, hey, at least within this context of the United States, where we have a history of foodborne illness being transmitted through ground beef due to other factors associated with our large-scale food processing systems in this country, that make that heighten the risk associated with foodborne illness as it's linked to ground meats. Okay, and therefore the government through the Food Code says avoid it if you want to, really decrease your risk of foodborne illness associated with ground meats. Then cook it until it's well done, and then you pretty much take care of foodborne illnesses associated with that style of food. Okay, but then on the other hand, we've got personal preference and restaurant sort of convention, or the way we do things, and that is to cook it the way we want it, and to offer the customer to cook it the way that they want it. And so there is arguably greater risk associated with that product, okay, because it's not cooked all the way through to 165 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 15 seconds to kill the foodborne illnesses that are typically associated with raw ground meat. All right, so it's not that we can't eat it. Okay, it's just that the associated risk is a little bit higher. So I'll give you some more context here. Okay, depending on you and your health, the concern may be more or less. And if a person arguably is healthy and their immune system is robust, then there's not a whole lot of concern around the foods that we eat. But if you fall into a category of a higher risk population, such as an infant or a child or an elderly person or otherwise somebody with a compromised immune system, then you are at greater risk of becoming sick if those pathogens are present. They're not always present. And if they're not present, then there's no problem at all. I mean, in my life, I have eaten raw chicken and raw horse and raw beef and raw fish and all kinds of raw stuff, and I've never gotten sick. That's in large part because of the clean sourcing of that food, as well as, I think, my immune system. And at least I'd like to chalk it up to that in some part. And so it's kind of a complicated story, but I hope that helps you understand the different factors at play here. So it's not that you can't, it's just that it's not recommended because the government doesn't know who's going to be doing the eating. Okay, thank you. All right, hello Trish. What's the best way to source, the best way or source to develop a reference dictionary for words to describe flavor, taste, texture, aroma, color, etc., to use for menus, marketing, and graded assignments, etc. For example, there's a coffee wheel and a wine wheel. Okay. If you do a Google search, you will find a number of websites that have some sort of a glossary or some sort of a resource for food descriptions that help with menu descriptions as well as Ruby assignments. And, off the top of my head, I don't remember the names of these websites, but I have seen them. So that would be my quick answer. I've seen a number of different lists. Some are more or less comprehensive than the other. So you can do some digging and find which one you prefer, but that's going to be the best source. Thank you. Next up, can you offer any suggestions on how you incorporate spices into vegetable dishes, especially Asian spices? Do you use ghee or no oil at all? Okay. So we got a couple of different questions here, and I'll respond to the second one first. I don't do a whole lot of no oil cooking. Sometimes I do. On the other hand, I use a fair amount of ghee. That's probably my preferred fat when I'm cooking. Unless for some reason I don't want the flavor of the butter. But the ghee otherwise provides a relatively high smoke point because it's minus the milk solids of whole butter and minus the water of whole butter. Okay, so it's 100% fat, and it has nice flavor. The first part of the question, how to incorporate spices into dishes, especially Asian spices. So, there's certainly practice that's involved here, and I think it means really going to some practice recipes to get to know how ingredients combine. A shortcut down this path is to use a reference book, and one that comes to mind is called the Flavor Bible. There's a counterpart from the same authors called the Vegetarian Flavor Bible. There's a lot of overlap between those two books, but there's a couple different versions depending on what you might prefer. There are other titles as well, but these are nonetheless books that look at regional cuisines as well as sort of food groupings and these flavors through spices and herbs that go together in a way that works based upon experience. And so these are great places to study and to kind of tinker with, and you learn a lot that way. The other thing is, just start to build up your inventory of spices and to start to play with fresh herbs, whether it's galangal or lemongrass, and certainly ginger and different chilies and kaffir lime leaves and sansho and these different ingredients, and then just see how they play out in a given dish. And you might introduce just one at a time to understand how the flavors and the aromas, and therefore the whole package comes together. And then you can start to add more than one, right, to add complexity, but to learn how they work. Taste them on their own before you add them to the pot. Smell them on their own so you understand what they offer. And then that's going to start to give you some insight as to what comes together, okay? Again, in a way that's going to be sort of naturally enjoyable, right, to your own palate experience. All right? Thank you. All right, Lorena, hola. Another question. It's been almost 5 months since I got my chef's knives, and I've been honing them since. Do you think it's time to get my whetstones? If the knives are still sharp and still doing the job satisfactorily, and honing them still restores them to that level of performance each day, then they don't need sharpening. Just kind of use that as the guideline. If you get to the point where the honing on the steel doesn't restore a sharp edge, then it's time to get them sharpened on the stones. All right, thank you. And next one, sauteing potatoes. Is it best to soak the cut potatoes in water before cooking? I seem to always have trouble with sticking. Aha. So soaking potatoes will draw out some of the potato starch, at least the starch that's close to the surface of that, the cut surface. There's still plenty of other stuff in there that will encourage the potato to stick to the pan. Certainly do your own experiment and see if the soaking makes a meaningful difference for you. I find that when cooking potatoes, I'm either using, ample fat, oftentimes ghee, or a nonstick pan if I want to go oil-free. And those are the two most successful or trouble-free methods to cooking potatoes that I have found. Thank you. All right, next up, hello and glad you're here. Thank you, Patricia. Glad you're here and that you join in every couple of weeks. It's so nice to see you. I'd like to ask for the notes functions to be available on all recipes, not just the ones in an active class. Is that possible? I use this database of recipes almost daily. All right, excellent. I'm glad to know that the Ruby recipe library is serving you well. And I'm certainly happy to pass on this suggestion to the recipe team and our engineers that would be a part of that process as well. So I don't have a definite answer for you, but I'm happy to share your request. Thank you. All right, next up, I have to confess. Okay, it's confession time. I have to confess that I will use my microwave to steam vegetables, or I will place my potatoes in the microwave first to soften and then roast in the oven to speed up the process. Can you speak to best uses of the microwave or worst uses? Since our microwave pooped out, almost 2 years ago, we haven't used a microwave. And so let me kind of dig back into my memory here. I would first of all say that the ways that you described are fine uses of the microwave. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with using a microwave. I was never one to cook with a microwave. It was always a reheating device for me. But if a person has a personal preference around using a microwave for, what you're describing as par cooking the potatoes before finishing them in the oven, I think that's a smart thing to do. It's efficient. It activates those water molecules, generates heat from the inside. And I don't see anything wrong with that. And so if you're comfortable with, the techniques that you use, then continue with that. All right. Thank you. Next up from Brooke, what is the substitution ratio of fruit paste in recipes to more conventional granulated sugar? This is an interesting question. So a substitution question. So by the questioning, I'm guessing that what you're really after is the sweetness. You're asking about the sweetness of fruit pastes. And so I've got an answer here for you, and it depends, right? One of my favorite responses, it depends. And it depends on the fruit paste because some are sweeter than others. There are some particular dates that are intensely sweet, like medjool, for example. Whereas sometimes I'll make an apricot paste, which is much more tart than it is sweet. So it really depends on what you're using, number one. And then, and maybe that answers your question, but, otherwise, do keep in mind that in terms of selecting and using a fruit paste as a sweetener, that it also comes with a flavor attached to it, right? Whereas granulated sugar is flavorless. It has a taste that is sweet, but does not have an accompanying flavor, all right? And then fruit pastes also have moisture, and granulated sugar does not have moisture. Fruit paste has, color as well as other nutritional factors that are different from sugar. So, you might consider those other variables as well. Okay. Thank you. All right, next up. This is also from Brooke. I recognize part of the value of FOK, forks over knives, is letting go of thinking of food as macronutrients or micronutrients. However, I struggle with maintaining my iron stores. Are there recommendations for increasing iron in a plant-based diet? So I've got a couple of responses. I mean, number one would be that generally speaking, in terms of foods, right? Legumes, right? So your lentils and your beans, and even some seeds or grains, like quinoa comes to mind, and probably chia seeds, are considered good sources of iron. But the other side of this is that if you're truly having an issue with storing iron in your body, you might check in with a healthcare professional. It may be an issue that goes beyond cooking. All right, thank you. Hey, Cheryl. If I were to teach small plant-based cooking classes, would having this class and a food handler certification be enough to do so? What have you seen as being a really lucrative plant-based small business offering? So when you say this class, I'm not sure which class you're enrolled in exactly, but let me start off by saying that certainly the 6-month plant-based certification course covers all the bases that you would need, as an entree to doing something professionally. Along with that foundation of knowledge and a starting point of skill development, experience, right, is going to be very important to get you up that learning curve and down that experience path to the point where I'll say you're well-rounded, right, in what it is that you produce and the efficiency of producing it, and probably your comfort level as well. If we're talking about the forks over knives class, maybe. I'm not sure. I think it depends on the individual quite a bit, right, in terms of as well as what it is you want to do, right, in terms of the world of cooking. How broad or narrow or how shallow or deep you want to go in terms of the offerings on your menu, within your class. Okay. The 6-month pro plant course just offers a lot more than FOK, for example. So keep that in mind. The other parts of your question here, in conjunction with a food handler certification, the food handlers part, the food handler certification, the education part of it, is probably required, if not simply a good idea, even if you're doing in-home classes, informally, but still on a revenue generation basis. So, food handlers education comes from different organizations. And some are more or less in depth, and so you can kind of move through that, navigate those options as well. What have you seen as being really lucrative plant-based small business offerings? I think part of it depends on what the demand is, right, in your area. Periodically over the last number of years, I have done classes at, for example, Bob's Red Mill, the grain company. I have taught classes there. And let me see, I've, done some volunteer work. I've worked with some other, nonprofit organizations. And so it kind of depends on the demand, okay, in your area. I haven't done anything like out of my own home, for example. So I haven't had to worry about marketing and selling myself. There's always somebody else that's doing that for me, fortunately. So yeah, you'll probably want to, not necessarily, well, maybe you do want to work up a full-fledged business plan. That's usually what I recommend. But at least take a look at what's going on in your area. What forms of marketing, would be effective. The avenues for doing that, the costs that are involved, and get an idea of then what you might offer, right? I mean, on one hand, there's very, I'll say, simple sort of, cooking, how to prepare grains and flavor them in 5 different ways. Or there might be some more in-depth ways of making plant-based pastas and bringing together some sauces and some internal fillings to make more complex dishes. And so do take a look at what the demand might be. All right, thank you. Next up, we've got, let's see, how can I use aquafaba to make my vegan baked goods lighter? Do I need to whip it to achieve this? So, aquafaba in baking is typically, certainly it can be used as a liquid, simply as a liquid, but one of those sort of magical qualities of aquafaba in baking is to use it in place of egg whites. Right, so in terms of a meringue, right, in which case we will whip the bean water or the aquafaba to make a foam, and then that foam can be used very much, almost identically, with an egg white. It can be baked, or folded into things to add a light, airy quality. There are certainly some sources online. There's I think a brief section in our Essential Vegans Dessert course here at Ruby, as well as published books that go into greater depth with using aquafaba. But the quick answer is, if you want to use it like a meringue, then yes, you go ahead and whip it. The cool thing with aquafaba is that it's forgiving, so you can whip it more than once, whereas with egg whites, you can't. All right, so it's a pretty fun thing to play with. Thank you. All right, next up, another question from Patricia. No, it's the same question from Patricia. All right, let me move on. Andrea, giving up cheese has been the hardest. So I hear that quite a lot, actually. I read that dairy with beta-casein A2 is considered safer than A1, but why and why do you think? I found a Greek sheep's milk feta that seems to fit the criteria if and when I need a small dose of cheese. I don't know. This is one of those sort of food science questions and really falls outside of my realm here, focusing on the cooking. So I don't have an answer for you about the A1, A2 types of milk. But I would imagine that if you did some digging on the internet, you're bound to find some sort of an explanation. Thank you. All right, next up, Sammy says, I'm in Unit 10 in oil and fats, and I already read about it, but what about frying oils? Which one is best for deep frying to be used? Okay, so generally speaking, when we'll be cooking with oils at a high temperature, use a refined oil. And a refined oil, is a common oil like a, in quotes, vegetable oil at the grocery store, or canola oil or soybean oil that has, otherwise these little things in suspension filtered out of them, because those things will burn at a relatively lower temperature. And so they're filtered out, they're refined, and then the result is an oil that can be taken to a higher temperature, okay? And so those oils that I mentioned would be examples. There's refined avocado oil that I have seen on the market that has a pretty high smoke point and does really well with high temperature cooking. So those are a few suggestions for you. All right, thank you. And next up, hello. Thank you for being here. You betcha, I'm happy to do it. Can you please provide any advice on making a lentil meatloaf with good texture and flavor? We do have, I think, some lentil loaf and patty sort of guidelines somewhere in Ruby land. I guess I'd have to dig up which course it is that I saw that in. But otherwise, let me try to guess what the concern might be here. One thing that I've run across in the past would be a loaf or a patty that is maybe too dense. In which case I always make it an effort to incorporate other items to lighten that feel on the palate. Other items would include diced vegetables, whether it's a potato or a carrots or celery or something else, or it could be grains. Or it could even be other legumes in their whole form, while the lentils are maybe break down a little bit, become just a little bit pasty as a binder, along with any flours that might be added. Okay, but I like to add these other things in to lighten that feel on the palate. Now, there's always the option of adding a chemical leavener, right? Like a baking powder to further lighten that texture if that's the concern for you, okay? And give that a try and see how you like it. All right, thank you. All right, next up, see from Pamela, how long do fresh herbs stay fresh in the refrigerator? My own grown basil seems fresh for 3 weeks, but then got a bit shiny. Is that mold? It still smelled okay. So the shelf life of fresh herbs in the refrigerator really varies depending on the item. So for example, what I think of as these hardy or maybe hardy herbs like rosemary and thyme will last a pretty long time. Again, no pun intended there, but it could be a matter of weeks if they're kept somewhat moist. I like to wrap them in a moist towel to protect them from the dehydrating air of the refrigerator. While other things like cilantro or fresh basil can have a much, much shorter shelf life, numbered in a few days, in which case it's pretty important, in my experience anyway, to just use the product. Use it before you lose it. Now, when it comes to what you describe here, when you say shiny, I'm guessing that what you experienced here was the basil becoming too cold. So there are some vegetables, some leafy things that don't like really cold temperatures. And basil, at least the basil that I've seen, is one of those, and it develops this sort of a wet look to it, which is damage from the cold temperature. And it's probably not mold. That's my guess. And certainly if you're in doubt, go ahead and toss it, but it's probably not mold. It's probably still good to use in some sort of a casserole, soup, stew sort of an application, rather than as a finishing garnish. Okay. Thank you very much. And so Vanessa asks, does Ruby have a video on how to sharpen knives? Yes, we've got some video lessons as well as a short lesson in there that addresses that. Just like a standalone lesson. And look at that. It looks like Patrick just listed up there how to use a whetstone, right? Sharpening stones. And then we also have the accompanying short lesson on how to hone the knife with a steel. So there's two parts, right, to knife maintenance. So occasional sharpening on a stone, and then daily maintenance on a steel. All right, thank you. All right, next up. Thank you for the valuable office hours. You bet. It's my pleasure, Radha. I'm glad you can join us. What would you recommend for baking surface for homemade pizza? A pizza stone, steel base, or ceramic stone? Also, any recommendations on the peel, steel versus wood? Aha, so this is a fun question. I'll tell you what I use. I use a steel plate, and I had this custom cut at a steel yard at the north end of town here a few years ago. So I measured, the oven rack so it fits, it maximizes the space and size of the oven. Let's see here. I'm trying to remember here. I am using a, oh wow, it's a 1/4 inch plate. I wish I could run upstairs and just take a measure for you here, but it might be 1/4 inch, and thick steel, pretty heavy if you want to take it in and out on a regular basis. But if you're dedicated pizzaiolo, that's no problem, right? 1/4 inch would be the minimum I would recommend. And if you can even bump that up to 3/8 of an inch, then it will hold lots of heat to develop a nice crispy crust. And, I will warm up that steel for 45 to 60 minutes before we start baking. I position the steel, or the plate on the rack at the very top, so it's right below the broiler. So I warm up the oven for almost an hour on the highest temp. In this case, it's 550 degrees Fahrenheit. And then when it comes time to put the pizzas in, I switch to the broiler setting. And it's on high, all right. And then the pizzas, thin crust, go in on the steel plate, and within 2 minutes, pizzas are done. All right, so 2 minutes maximum, depending on what's going on and how thin it is. It could be as quickly as 90 seconds, but about 2 minutes, and you've got pizzas coming out. Okay, and so that works really well for me. I end up I have both a wood and a steel peel, and I I put the pizzas in with a wooden peel, and I remove it with a steel peel. It just works out that way. All right. Hope that helps you. Thank you. Next up, when I make my plant-based milk myself, it won't froth when I crave espresso macchiato. I tried to add aquafaba, but that didn't work. It's the only option to buy the milk because both the purchased soy and almond milk work great. Well, my guess here, Myra, is that the store-bought product, with all of its added stuff, it's probably its gums and stabilizers and things, provide that network of protein and things that help the frothing process. And certainly we find that same matrix present in animal milk. But so that's the trade-off, I suppose. That's the trade-off. Thank you. All right. Next up. How do I go about giving my students assignments in Ruby? Well, so Jessica, it sounds like you're a chef instructor somewhere. And, I'll give you the quick answer, but a better discussion, I think, would be had if you reach out to us at support.ruby.com. We can set up an appointment to talk in depth as needed. But basically, assignments are built into our courses. How you do that depends on the course that is assigned, that you're using and assigned to your students. Some of these assignments are graded by you. Some are graded by us. And some can be cherry picked and sort of assigned by you as needed. So there's some different scenarios there. Okay, but I think some more discussion might be had with our student support team to help you out. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I'm doing the Pro Cooking Certification course, and now I'm at 35% in my progress on time, or I'm behind. Also, I appealed for one result to be redone again. How long will it take to reply back? So, look for your appeals pretty soon here. We just had a nice holiday weekend in the U.S., and so some of us were taking an extended break. But we'll get back to you very soon in terms of an appeal. Now, in terms of if your dashboard tells you that you're 35% through the course, that refers to your progress, not the time ticking on the 6-month clock. Okay, so you'll need to just refer to the date that you started your course and then count out 6 months and then see where you are today relative to that 6-month point. And you can get an idea of how far you are time-wise, okay, throughout the period that's allotted. But you can always inquire about an extension to the course as well. Okay, thank you. All right, next up from Ruth. Can you please share some pictures or recommend plastic containers in the 1 to 2 quart or liter capacity under training and the straining and washing category? Yes, I can certainly do that. Ruth, may I please ask you to send in some information on the course as well as the task number that you're referring to. I'd be happy to take a look at that. You can reach me at Ruby, at Ruby, but at support at ruby.com. Thank you. All right, Sammy, regarding the French fry question earlier, which potato is the best to be purchased and how can we decaffeinate it from other kinds of potato? Most of the time we do French fries ended by dark color and full of oil. Okay, is it good to soak with vinegar? Okay, great. So the decaffeination part of your question, I'm not sure what that refers to. So I'll skip over that, and I'll say that the probably the best potato is going to be a russet potato, otherwise known as a mealy potato. Okay, versus a waxy potato, which tends to have a relatively higher sugar content. And it's the sugar that browns so quickly and so darkly. Okay, so reach for a russet potato, and does it help to soak in the vinegar? Give it a try. Those 2 recipes that Patrick posted a few minutes ago, one of them utilizes vinegar, and I think one of them doesn't. And you might just see which one you prefer yourself. Thank you. All right. And next one, I have been having a little challenge with the position of my guide hand while cutting. What is a trick to stay consistent with the position? All right, Tamiko, it's about practice. It really is. And, I'm sorry I don't have a funner response or an easier response, but it really is about keeping the discipline and the engagement as you have that knife against your knuckle, and choose, that positioning that's going to be most natural and comfortable for you. But start out slowly, right, as you use that claw and sort of inch your way back across the cutting board. And then with repetition, with practice, you're going to gain the confidence. And then with confidence, you can start to add more speed to your cutting. And before you know it, you'll be just scooting across that cutting board. But it really takes practice and frequent cutting to work your way up that learning curve. Okay. Now, if you think that you might have a unique sort of a issue that you might be working with, unique to your hands, your fingers, your knife, your cutting board combination, feel free to take a short video clip and send that in, and I'll be happy to give you some feedback, as possible. Thank you. All right. Next up, are sprouted potatoes okay to use? I use them all the time just because I don't like throwing things away, and I don't see anything wrong with them. I think I take the sprouts off though, right, so that the end user doesn't see the sprouts. But I think they're fine. All right, thanks. What's your favorite tips for making a mole? I would just say choose your type of mole, and there's so many of them out there, and follow through with getting the accurate ingredients, whether it's Ritz crackers or some sort of a unsweetened chocolate or something else that's called for, and then it's probably good to find a resource that might talk a little bit about the process. Okay, the grinding and combining process of the ingredients. But otherwise, it's not. It's not a real complex process. You just do it a couple of times, and you'll see how things come together. But then also to eat some mole preparation, so you've got a baseline for flavor, I think is a good thing as well. Okay, I have come across some moles made by folks that didn't have that baseline palate, reference, and they were kind of often left field. So I think if you can get some palate experience, that will help guide the process as well. Thank you. Next up, I'm 21 weeks pregnant and not gaining any weight. Is this normal while eating whole food plant-based? Do you have recommendations for helping with healthy weight gain during pregnancy while eating whole food plant-based? Thanks in advance. Well, this is definitely a healthcare professional question that goes beyond the realm of cooking and ingredient selection here. I've certainly met a lot of people that have gone through pregnancy and beyond on a whole food plant-based diet. But otherwise, I think for your particular situation, you might consider reaching out to your healthcare professional. Thank you. And next up, I bet from Hannah, so I bet Eric will say, talk to your OB. Yes, just a thought. If your doc isn't whole food plant-based friendly, the Barnard Medical Center is doing telemedicine in many states now. Excellent. Dr. Angie Sadegi's clinic, if you need good doc or dietitian connections. Excellent. Thank you, Hannah, for those ideas. Let's see. Next up, what's the best way to make whole food plant-based garlic bread? My family loves garlic bread, and my son is obsessed with butter. I love a healthier option to serve them. So let me address this in two parts, the bread and the butter, starting with the butter first. As I mentioned earlier in today's program, consider just one of the plant-based butter options out there. I mentioned Kite Hill and Miyoko's as a couple of popular brands of these butter substitutes. And regarding the bread itself, starts using some whole grain flour. And you might start with whole grain wheat flour because it's going to be the easiest transition from a white wheat flour, right, in terms of gluten content. And then you might start tinkering with the addition of other grains, either whole or in the flour form. For example, you might cook off some quinoa and fold that into the dough. And, you'll have a nice whole wheat bread that's, speckled with quinoa grains. And so that can be a much more nutritious and interesting and flavorful, enjoyable option over a white loaf of bread. Thank you. And it looks like, Hannah has another a bit of some things to share, okay, with Tracy and Adrian. Thank you very much, Hannah. And then the next item, what's the best way to find a chef local to where we are to apprentice with after finishing the professional course? So this is a really interesting question. There's not an easy answer. I certainly don't have an easy answer to share. A couple of ideas. You might consider looking online at some of these professional chef organizations and then finding chefs in that network that are local to you, and then filtering to find somebody that is plant-based and is willing to work with you. Reach out to them and have a conversation. Otherwise, find a restaurant nearby that interests you. Reach out to them and have a conversation with them. Very often, in order to get one's foot in the door, it's necessary to work for free. Sometimes just for a day. Sometimes it's for a week. We call that a stage. Sometimes they're paid. Often they're not. But the idea is for both sides, both parties, you as well as the restaurant staff, to see if the relationship is going to work. And then you figure out how to proceed from there. But I think reaching out to folks, for an introduction and to have a conversation might be the most expedient way to do that. Right? Thank you. Okay. Let me jump down to Brenda here. Good day. This question is regarding plant-based diets. What do you think about vegetable and fruit tablets like Vitafruit, Super Beets, etc.? Are they good supplements along with fresh vegetables and fruits? This is an interesting question and one that I will, I think, limit my response on, only because that's not, the supplement realm is not my space. I am of the belief that if one eats a varied diet that is otherwise balanced in quantity and all of its goodness, that supplements are not necessary. Now, that's probably true of most people most of the time, but there are certainly exceptions out there. And if you think you're an exception or know you're an exception, then supplements definitely play a role. So I don't rule them out. In terms of these particular products, I haven't used any of them and don't know any of them in any detail. And so you might take a look online for some reviews and some commentary on these products. All right, thank you. And next up, is it possible to make non-dairy yogurt in a dehydrator? Also, as I can't find vegan yogurt where I live, can I use probiotics to start the culture? So when you say, can I use a dehydrator, I'm guessing you're talking about the environment, right? Creating a warm environment. And yes, you can definitely use a dehydrator. And also, yes, you can use probiotics. So what's often used is probiotic capsules, and the capsules are simply opened up and the powder is dumped into the mixture. And then that will do the work. Thank you. Next up from Janet. I just viewed the videos on how to cut with a chef's knife. What kind of cutting board is best to use? Right now I have a wooden one. Great question. So let me start off, first of all, by saying that I recommend avoiding particularly hard surfaces, because I think it's going to be pretty obvious, right, that a harder surface is going to wear down the blade faster than a softer surface. Okay, so all these cutting board materials in the world, they all lie on a spectrum, right, of hardness. And I have seen cutting boards made of glass and of stainless steel. I don't use those. I also wouldn't cut on concrete, directly on a concrete countertop, for example. I've got wood and plastic cutting boards, but even within the natural fiber space and the synthetic space, there are different materials. Um, I think generally speaking, you're going to be fine, within those material categories, right? I.e., not stainless steel and glass. But if you look online, you will find different kinds of wood or natural fiber. Some people say that bamboo is too hard. Bamboo is okay, in my opinion. It's harder than some other materials. Other softer woods include hinoki, which is Japanese cypress, and there are other woods that are relatively soft that are used for cutting boards in certain regions of the world. I'm most familiar with cutting boards from Japan, which are relatively soft woods, but they do great, right, as cutting boards. Synthetic materials come to mind. Hasegawa is a company that makes professional cutting boards. I've seen some with a wooden core and a bond of synthetic rubber material, hard rubber, on either side, so you can use both sides. But it's got some firmness to it. And then there are other companies, other boards that are 100% synthetic, but they're made of these formulas that have some appeal within the professional circle of cooks and chefs. They allow your cutting edge to last longer. So those are my thoughts on cutting boards. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I'm interested in raw food diet tips, recipes, no oil, sugar, flour, processed flour, suggesting good recipes, especially for preparing Brussels sprouts. Okay, so I see 2 or 3 maybe different topics embedded here. So let me take a look at this. So, when it comes to a raw food diet, I think what most of us talk about is incorporating some raw food into our diet. Most people that talk about a raw food diet really aren't on a 100% raw food diet. And I will share a couple of things. A 100% raw food diet is difficult to maintain. It becomes restrictive, and that runs contrary to much of what we encourage at Ruby, which is a more varied diet. But having some raw components is quite fine, okay? But for our bodies to process raw food is relatively difficult compared to cooked food, okay? And the handful of people on a 100% raw food diet that I have met have been underweight because the body consumes so much energy in the digestion process that it's really hard to put on weight. Hence, cooked food is important. Many people would say, with raw food components in the diet. All right, so that's my raw food response here. Now, when it comes to the no oil, no sugar, and no processed food approach to cooking, you're asking for any suggestions on good recipes. There are, many good recipes per se, but it's all about what you enjoy, okay? And allowing yourself to enjoy the foods in this category of cooking now. To eliminate oil, to eliminate sugar, shifts the palate experience significantly, okay, in foods. So to go cold turkey might be difficult, but to slowly cut back on these things might be more realistic for many consumers, okay, to avoid frustration and maybe binge eating sometimes, right? Or craving fats and sugars, right? To talk about this a little bit further, when we talk about no oil, we're really talking about no added oils, right? So having fat in your diet through whole food sources is still very important, okay? And then having sweeteners in your diet might be very desirable in their whole food form, although, all the while maybe cutting back or eliminating added sugar, okay? Processed flour. So I'm going to interpret this as refined flour, that is to say white flour, all right? To have whole grain flour, right, with its bran and other constituents intact, can be fine if it's balanced, right? Even that in excess arguably is not the best balance a lot of times. And I say, I'm talking about this because whole grains, right? In other words, the elimination of flour and to eat only grains in their whole form can be restrictive and difficult for a lot of people. Additional flavor, depth, and interest that comes from the browning process that can be had from roasting in the oven or sauteing on the stovetop can make Brussels sprouts much more enjoyable. All right, so give that a try. And then also consider adding some additional flavorings through spices. I'm also a fan of spices. And, you might start with something like cumin and coriander, which are often used together, when they're added to a dish, and just see how you like that. And then you can move into some other spices. Okay, or fresh herbs maybe on top of that might work for you. Okay, thank you. All right. Next up. All right, so Jeffrey, okay, yeah, this is in response to the earlier question about the Vitamix, using smaller containers. Okay, excellent. Carol has a follow-up. Excellent. Thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate the discussion here. And next up from Amy, thank you for your time. You bet. I'm happy to be here. I love taking your course. I've been making oat milk from gluten-free whole rolled oats. Is it possible to make oat milk from gluten-free oat flour? What difference can I expect? Also, does the water temperature change the result, if any? Water result, I don't know. I've always used cold water when making oat milk. And, well, I've never used flour. I've always used the rolled oats, but I don't know that there's necessarily a big difference that I would expect between the two. Oat milk can have a sliminess that develops, and that's going to be true of rolled oats as well. And, I would say give it a try. I would, of course, don't use, maybe hot water. That starts to change. The temperature will start to change some of the qualities of the food product you're starting with. But cold water will have the most neutral effect. Okay? And just see how you like it. Thank you. Next up, thank you, says Ruth. Okay, great. It's in the kitchen tools cheat sheet. Okay, Pro Cook. Okay, so let me write down here, Pro Cook kitchen tools cheat sheet. Thank you for following up, Ruth. I'll take a look at that. Next up, okay, so how to integrate Ruby into Canvas for my high school online classes. So I'm going to have you please reach out to our consulting team or other members of our education team at support@ruby.com to walk you through the options that we have when we work with teachers in culinary programs. Okay, and all right. So Vanessa says, "Thank you, Maria, for asking the knife question, and Eric for your demonstrative answers. You bet." Thank you. I recently locked up my right shoulder, and although I have been ambidextrous my whole life, I'm having difficulty retraining my brain for left-handed knife cutting. Okay. Well, gosh, I'm happy to hear you've got some sort of a basis of ambidexterity to drop back on, and hopefully that all that muscle memory comes back sooner than later. All the best to you in the kitchen. All right, and this brings us to the end of today's questions and today's office hours. I want to thank you all very much for joining me, whether you dropped in from the beginning or sometime midstream, and for all of your participation and engagement today. I look forward to seeing you next time with all of your questions. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.